everyone. This is the Ophthalmology Business Podcast, where we help you develop your ideal practice with the help of other doctors and experts. The topics we cover include marketing, management, leadership, recruitment, HR, mindsets, and more. I'm Sarah Duval, one of the co-hosts of the podcast. Every listener of this podcast is welcome to join the Ophthalmology Business Academy at www.obacademy.org. The membership is on us, and it's our gift to you. Today, I'm excited to talk with Michael Gelcher, Managing Partner and Founder at Prism Consulting Partners, a consulting and advisory firm specializing in leadership coaching, culture, and employee development, as well as practice development and evolution planning. So Mike and I sat down for a podcast, gosh, what was it? 3-4 months ago, Mike, and we were talking about his company, Prism Consulting Partners, and part of what we were talking about, which is very, very important in a post-pandemic world, was leadership. And we're actually on the road as we record this. We've got the Ophthalmology Business Academy Roadshow. We are we're actually in Nashville for the ASCRS ASOA summer meeting as we are recording this. And I actually just got done in a session about setting boundaries and saying no. And, you know, a big theme in that session, and Mike knows because he sat in on it, but a big theme in there was leadership, right? Yeah. And that's something that's very important to Mike and his partners with Prism Consulting Partners. So, Mike, why don't we pick up where we left off and where we were kind of talking at lunch? You want to go ahead and take the lead on leadership in the post-pandemic world and why it's so important in the practices.
Yeah. So without rehashing, the conversation from a couple months ago, we'll kind of give a Reader's Digest version of where we ended up. But it's really, we've returned to this, whatever they're calling the new normal, and there's been a lot of talk around, our workforce and their level of engagement and being able to effectively lead. And, I think the best jumping off point of any would be to simply state that an engaged team, a highly engaged team can only be as engaged as the leader is engaged. And in our current world, it's been estimated by the Gallup organization that our global GDP suffers to the tune of $7.8 trillion because of low engagement. Gallup has researched organizations of all shapes, sizes, kinds, healthcare, Fortune 5, non-Fortune 5. But when they take all the numbers out of it and net it down, the two big things that come out of it are, one, the lack of engagement. But the second thing that pops out of it that became a very staggering statistic, I knew there would be a difference, I didn't realize it would be this much, is that organizations with highly engaged employees are 23% more profitable than those who are not. So when you sort of think about those numbers and extrapolate them out over numerous practices and, multi-site and big locations, those numbers get big pretty quickly. And so what we start to find out when we do this research is that, yes, we know that leadership matters in theory, but it actually matters to the bottom line too, because your influence and ability to engage a team and empower a team, and we can talk about some of that stuff in this conversation, has incredible financial impact. And it's really beginning to get discussion now in light of the challenges that I think many people have hiring, the challenges people have in retaining employees and developing employees, and what that looks like in a practice these days. It's not an easy job, but people have more control over it than they may realize.
Yeah, it's definitely not an easy job at all. So I'm listening to this podcast, and maybe I'm not the practice leader or manager. Maybe the practice manager isn't a leader at all. So what can you do? What can you do? What can Prism Consulting Partners do to help a practice who's really suffering in the leadership category?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that we'll do with the client is what's called an alignment check. And in that alignment check, you're essentially getting on board with the key stakeholders to acknowledge some of the facts that are out there. We perform a very short complimentary questionnaire, with a client, and it simply centers around simple, basic questions. And the premise behind the questionnaire that comes from us is because when you think about asking difficult questions of an employee, the challenge becomes that they're tied to a paycheck, and an internal perspective is less likely to be the most transparent one. Yet somebody from the outside who has no vested stake in whether things go one direction or another, other than our desire to help the practice go the direction they're looking to go, those questions get answered differently, is my point. So one of my partners put it best when he said that we'll ask the questions that most people can't to get the answers that they want, if that makes sense.
So how do you get started? Because inevitably there's going to be feedback, pushback.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
So how do we start? How do you combat that?
So when you're in these conversations, I think it's important to do what we know is to start with our intent, right? Why are we doing this? And I think one of the things that often gets overlooked in organizations is just team building and culture. And we know it matters more these days than ever because number one, the numbers indicate it. And number two, it is a central indicator of practice health. Because if you've ever had a healthcare experience or walked into any kind of practice, be it eye care or otherwise, and when people are engaged, you can feel it, you can tell in their body language, you can tell how they're being treated. And so what this questionnaire essentially gives us the ability to do is really get down to, what is the heart of the matter, whether it is people don't feel like they have a career path in front of them, or my manager doesn't listen to me, or they don't have my best interest at heart. One of the interesting statistics that came from the Gallup research was that when senior leaders were asked if they felt like an organization had the employee's best interest at heart, the overwhelming majority said, well, yes, of course. Yet when you survey the employees, you got a much different answer. And so our job is to bridge that gap, to bridge that disconnect, to identify the critical issues that are needed to raise awareness about what a healthy culture looks like, raise awareness about what good boundaries look like, to some of the points you alluded to in your discussion an hour ago. So those are just two examples of things that we get into, whether it be through roundtable discussions, facilitating problem solving, a concept we call a workout, where you're throwing ideas out on the board, and working with the key stakeholders. But before you go in and do any of that difficult work, you have to have acknowledgement from the people that have an ownership in it. They have to acknowledge that it matters. They have to acknowledge that it's relevant and that it is a real thing that's keeping the practice from going in a direction that they're seeking to take it. So it starts with that discussion. And then from there, you dig into what applies the most and what's going to make the most meaningful difference.
So what does that conversation look like with those stakeholders though? Because I feel like, and this sounds very cynical, but I think it's true, that a lot of times, as long as the money is coming in, there's no problem, right?
Yeah.
There's no problem. The money is coming in. There's no problem.
Well, there's often no problem because the stakeholders you talk about, the doctors, typically just say, well, that's the job of the administrator. That's the job of the manager. Like that's their thing to handle. And I'm not suggesting that that's the response every time, but I think when it comes to matters of human resource management, I mean, there's good leaders out there, like some of the ones you were sitting up there with today, and there's a reason that they say, put your first resources toward human resources, right? I mean, there's a reason they said that. You need to make sure you've got appropriate support as you continue to develop employees. And so part of the reason you'll get pushback, which is good and bad. It's not great that you get pushback, but it's also good because people care. And if they're just sitting there silently, that tells me that there's no engagement in the process. But if you're pushing back on the idea, that's okay. But what they also have to understand is, what's the consequence of doing nothing? Because you're right, most practices will continue to succeed in spite of themselves because of the dynamics, because of the shifting demographics in our population, and because of the expanded services that they're fortunate to be able to offer to that population. So this oftentimes on scale of issues falls lower than you would, low as you would probably expect. But when you flip that around and they say, geez, we have a hard time retaining, keeping people, now we're starting to uncover the reason why.
Hmm. So I want to shift gears, do a little pivot. Off air, we were talking about, developing leaders within our practice.
Yes.
And you mentioned something about chutes and ladders.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, I don't exactly remember how that whole conversation went. And that was a new one to me. So
Yeah.
talk to the audience about, I'm teeing that one up for you. Talk to me about, what that was all about in this chutes and ladders with
Yeah.
employee development into leadership.
Yeah. So chutes and ladders is, for some people may recall, was a game that was, invented some years ago. And in that game, you would take a game piece and work your way up the board from bottom to top. And there were 10 squares on each level of the board, as I recall. It may not be exactly that many, but there was a number of squares on each level. And if you landed at a certain point, you would either climb the ladder, or if you hit on a certain number, you would hit a chute and come back down. So that metaphorically sets the background for what I'm about to describe. What happens in the evolution of a practice culture is it's only as good as the behavior at scale that you see. So when you think about that, and when you think about employees, and just as importantly, leaders that exhibit the different traits that are required to have a healthy culture, um, you talk about it as a practice evolves and strengthens in those areas. What happens is during that climb, it can feel like a one step up and two steps back. And the one step up and two steps back analogy comes from things such as team dysfunction, lack of trust, lack of transparency, lack of understanding, people not being clear on what's expected of them, uh, people making assumptions, which we know can be very dangerous. So all those pitfalls that happen in the course of organizations that struggle lead to the chutes that we're talking about, decline. The climbs come from those formative moments where the culture builds, the culture becomes more than what it was previously. And that's when teams, whether they go through a challenging crisis, whether they go through a difficult moment, we believe that shared suffering can build bonds and can build trust in such a way that really gives you a platform to really advance. And so when you start to think about when anybody goes through a difficult challenge or a difficult situation, what you're really doing is building resiliency. And as a leader, you're modeling that for people, and you're building resiliency while still being able to demonstrate the empathy and understanding of your employees as you navigate a difficult circumstance, whatever that might be. We could come up with where we're short staffed by 3 people, and over the last 3 months, the 7 people that are carrying a log that should be carried by 10 people have admirably stepped in and have carried the load and have allowed themselves, to steal your phrase, to have the boundaries blurred a little bit for a temporary period of time, because they knew during that 90 days they just needed to step in. They needed to put their nose to the grindstone and really get after it. And to their credit, they do. And so I think it's important to celebrate those things, and those celebrations kind of become the ladders that elevate a culture. So when we think about it in our Prism leadership model, it goes from your basic training and your basic development to getting into things like equipping and empowering, and the real missionality that a practice seeks to attain. And you only attain those things when you start to have the behaviors at scale that are necessary to work through challenges. Because as was alluded to in the talk just an hour ago, most leaders have a tendency to want to take it all on. And they're fearful that that diminishes their worth or their identity, when the reality is the ability to share some of that responsibility really actually does the job of equipping and empowering. Because what you find is that most people want to be developed, most people want to have a career path, and most people want to see a path to advancement, whatever that looks like. It doesn't mean they want to necessarily become a manager, but maybe they want to become a higher level technician or become a COA or a COE like yourself. And so to be able to encourage people along that path and provide them those opportunities really gives them an opportunity to demonstrate their leadership and their own initiative. And so to me, that's what, plainly the ladder's part of the game is about. The chutes are when you struggle and honestly, you try to take too much on yourself, and you suffer because of that, because of whether it be lack of trust, lack of transparency, lack of communication, whatever the root cause might be.
That's a fun analogy. I used to love that game.
Great
Now
game.
it is. I should go play it. So you just mentioned something about the Prism leadership,
Yes.
right? You want to tell us a little bit about, is that something that you are developing? Is it developed? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it's basically in its foundational form. And what I mean by that is we've developed 12 courses that dive into different aspects of leadership. And then this is not specific to these, let me back up and say that these concepts are not industry specific. They can be transferred over between ophthalmology, optometry, any healthcare subspecialty. What it's really designed to do is better equip leaders to be leaders wherever they are in the state of a practice. I don't think that there is any owner doctor or owner administrator that would sit here today and tell you that they would say the phrase, I don't feel like my plate's full enough. Said no one ever, right? I mean, that's the reality of the world we're living in today. So part of shared leadership becomes the ability to see and have a vision for what happens when you engage your team in such a way that you allow them to rise. Because if you're only capable today of lifting a 500-pound log as a practice, our contention is unlocking 5, 7, 8 leaders within your practice who want that development, give you the ability to lift a much heavier log. And as the demands of our world continue to evolve, that's going to be the norm. I sat in a talk this morning that talked about how private equity can shape a career. I can tell you from experience that private equity will demand more of people, and to the extent that private practices today can build and grow their people to be more resilient, to be more change ready, to be more equipped leaders, they will be able to shine more in their careers, regardless of whether it continues to be the practice they know today or it becomes the practice as part of a bigger organization down the line. It's really about equipping people for the expected while preparing them for the unexpected. And that's a part of why we put Prism Leadership Institute in place.
Yeah, practices really are missing the mark on not empowering and developing their people. And I think we were talking earlier about, you say it happens far more than I probably think. Is that accurate to say that a lot of practices?
Yes, because we hear it all the time, and we hear it in the form of some of the frustrations that get expressed, whether we are dealing with leaders of different small organizations, big organizations, practices. You also see it if you ever look up a website called Glassdoor. If any organization is big enough in size, you will see what the people have to say about it. And now, granted, anytime you have a big sample size, you have to strip out the outliers. But when you look at the averages and you look at the common themes that you hear, there's a reason that this morning in the breakout, the breakout room that was filled the most was the one about leadership. There's a reason. And the reality is effectively leading and in these times really requires a lot more tools, frankly, than some people possess. And it's not to say that it's their fault. It's actually not their fault. What happens is you show up with the tools you have, but if all you're there to do is the job you've got, and nobody's pouring more tools into your belt to help you with your career journey, you're going to continue to spin in the same circle that you find yourself in day to day. And so I know that's a frustrating point for people, because when we do the research, it's two of the reasons that people leave roles. They don't see a future for themselves, and they don't feel like they're being developed. And there are many people, even in these younger generations, that seek that a great deal.
I'm so glad that leadership has really come to the forefront in recent years. Is it's something that I'm very passionate about. I expressed to you before that I don't necessarily feel like I've had very strong leaders in my career. I've sort of had to just get out there and do it on my own and figuring out on my own and make my own opportunities and develop myself. But then, I was also telling you that a quote that I love is be the leader you wish you had had.
Yeah.
And I think that that resonates with a lot of people now. And maybe they're actually stopping and realizing I don't have a great leader. Or maybe somebody is humble enough to realize that maybe I haven't always been the best leader. And it's not too late to ever turn that around. And, your company is very passionate about this, very strong, and it seems like it's something that you could really help people to do, because it's not going away, Mike. It's not going away. People are going to realize more and more the importance of it.
Yeah, absolutely, Sarah. Or I think people get misaligned is where they treat training as an event and not a process. An example is we've got this course online you could take for LinkedIn Learning, and now you're a better leader as a result of it. No, that's a transactional event. And what we're talking about is transforming actual people and skills and behaviors that are more sustainable and more effective and more virtuous in the long run. That's what we're trying to achieve. And so those skills have carryover effects. They have carryover effects into your personal life. They have carryover effects in the home. They have carryover effects in the community that you serve. And so it really becomes more about showing up and being your most authentic self, and at the same time being available to others within the allocated times, right? Because we talked about boundaries, but it's also about just being intentionally present and there, and having the humility to admit what you don't know, because that to me becomes a trap of the leader who tries to make themselves indispensable. Um, Really, what the leader should be is the most dispensable person on the team if they're raising and lifting others. Um, as I'm having this conversation with you, I wanted to read a poem, if you don't mind. Um, and it was kept on, it was written by an author named Saxon White Kessinger, and a former president, trying to remember who it was that kept it on his desk. The president is slipping my mind, but you'll get the idea. The name of the poem is called Indispensable Man by Saxon White Kessinger. Do you mind if I read it?
Not at all. Please do.
Okay, go right ahead. Here we go. Sometime when you're feeling important, sometime when your ego's in bloom, sometime when you take it for granted you're the best qualified in the room, sometimes when you feel that you're going would leave an unfillable hole, just follow these simple instructions and see how they humble your soul. Take a bucket and fill it with water, put your hand in it up to the wrist, pull it out, and the hole that's remaining is a measure of how you'll be missed. You can splash all you wish when you enter. You may stir up the water galore, but stop and you'll find that in no time, it looks quite the same as before. The moral of this quaint example is just do the best you can. Be proud of yourself, but remember, there's no indispensable man.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Oh, I
Yeah,
love that. Thank you very much.
of course.
And I think that that might actually be a good stopping point. You said it best when you just said that poem.
Yeah, I mean, um, it's very easy to get caught up in the idea of our own self-importance and realize that as leaders, we're in the business to serve others first. Um, I think there are a lot of people who are terrific leaders in our world. But the idea of the team first is not just something that we have to preach in word. We've got to preach it in deed. And as I alluded, I think the phrase I shared with you in the previous discussion is that your audio's got to match your video. There's got to be alignment between the two, or your team will see right through it. So the idea here, I think, Sarah, with Prism Leadership Institute and what we're going to offer is just that, how to create the culture that spawns effective and virtuous leaders. That's what we're trying to do, because we know in the presence of that the practice financials and all the results that come with it are more profitable because they have highly engaged teams. And when you have highly engaged teams, you're a more profitable organization than when you're not, to the tune of 23% as an average. Sometimes the number is even greater. So we know the economic benefits are there. We know people want to minimize turnover. We know people want to maximize engagement. It really comes down to ingraining the right skills and behaviors in others in order to do that. And again, everybody's a part of the team. No one person more or less important. But at the end of the day, none of us are indispensable, as the poem says much better than I could.
Thank you, Mike, for such another great conversation.
Yeah.
Before we go, if you want to just tell the listeners again the name of your firm and where people can find you and how they can reach out to you.
Yeah, it's you can find us at prismconsultingpartners.com. We'll be excited to be at some meetings upcoming this fall, but you can reach us on our website, and you can reach me at mgelcher, Guelcher, at prismconsultingpartners.com, and cell phone's 803-412-1172. So just glad to have this conversation with you, Sarah, and thanks for having around too. It's been great to meet you in person here.
Yes, likewise. And hey, you know what? Maybe there'll be a round 3 as the Prism leadership gets up and going.
Hey, as it evolves, who knows? Well, up next, maybe Boston. Who knows?
Yeah, true. Right? In my backyard.
That's right. That's right.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate your time today.
You're my pleasure. I also want to take a moment to thank our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you. We cannot do what we do without you. If you like our podcast, kindly share it with your friends and on social media. Also, please don't forget to write a review on iTunes or Google Play. Your reviews will help other doctors and practice owners find us. Till we meet again, wishing all of you an amazing week ahead.